Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on the traditional unceded Algonquin Nation territory this afternoon. Je vous souhaite tous la bienvenue à une discussion relativement informelle avec des gens très impressionnants, des membres de la fonction publique qui sont aussi membres de communautés autochtones à travers le Canada. It's a privilege for us on National Indigenous Peoples Day to hear from amazing senior Indigenous leaders in the public service about their career progression, their challenges, their opportunities, and hopefully will be inspirational to many of you. Et je veux vous remercier pour avoir pris le temps cet après-midi de célébrer cette journée très spéciale avec nous pour entendre parler directement de membres très impressionnants de la fonction publique, de membres de la communauté autochtone. I will now start by introducing Michelle Smith, who will open this session for us today. I believe that bios are being inserted into the chat to save time, but I will just say a few words about Michelle Smith. Michel est membre des Abénaquis de Danak depuis près de 30 ans. Il est le gardien d'un calumet sacré et il est très reconnaissant des enseignements traditionnels qu'il a reçus de plusieurs années et gardien du savoir. C'est un aîné en résidence à l'École de la fonction publique du Canada, ainsi qu'un aîné auprès du Cercle du savoir sur l'inclusion autochtone à Patrimoine Canada, qui est un des autres de l'événement aujourd'hui. Alors, Michel, merci beaucoup d'être avec nous et je vous cède la parole et je vous offre le tabac de façon virtuelle cet après-midi.
Merci beaucoup, Valérie. Creator, we give you thanks for this new day. Give you thanks for all of your creation. Créateur, nous remercions également notre Terre Maman, elle qui nous donne tout ce dont on a besoin afin de vivre une vie heureuse sur l'île de la Tortue. On this National Indigenous Peoples Day, we thank our ancestors. Thank our ancestors for their wisdom, for their courage, for their resilience. They were able to keep our traditions, our customs, our ceremonies, and our teachings and our pride alive and pass them on to us so that today we may celebrate. Créateur, on te demande de nous donner la sagesse de nos ancêtres afin que nous puissions également transmettre nos connaissances aux futures générations. We also pray today with a heavy heart as we remember our young brothers and sisters who were found in Kamloops less than a month ago. So we pray for all the children that never made it back home. Nous prions également pour tous les survivants des écoles résidentielles et tous ceux et celles qui ont souffert de la discrimination, du racisme systémique et de la violence. Creator, we ask that you give us today the wisdom to listen and to speak with an open heart and an open mind so that we may have a wonderful session full of respect and compassion. Kichiolioni, Chimigwech, Niawan, Kuyanamik, mercy, thank you, merci, Oho.
Well, Alan, Michel, merci beaucoup. So I'll start by introducing our first speaker who will be sharing some opening remarks and reflections. And it's a privilege for me to introduce my boss, Deputy Minister Christian Fox. who joined Indigenous Services Canada as the deputy in September of 2020. She's also Deputy Minister Champion of the Federal Youth Network, where I know that she has a lot of enthusiasm. Elle a commencé sa carrière comme conseillère en communication à Industrie Canada, maintenant connue sous le nom d'Innovation, Sciences et Développement économique Canada, où elle a travaillé dans les domaines de communication et des politiques scientifiques. Elle a également œuvré pendant 1 an au sein des groupes d'études sur les politiques en matière de concurrence à titre de directrice des communications et consultations. She and I both have a bachelor's degree in mass communications, although she also added psychology and did it at Carleton while I did it at Ottawa U. And she is also a graduate of the University of Ottawa's Master's Certificate Program in Public Administration. So welcome, Deputy Minister Fox, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Valérie, and it's been such a pleasure to work with you and the ISC team. Alors, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to join you here today. Merci, Michel. Thank you for your prayer and for starting us off in a good way, and in particular, your prayer to the children who did not make it back home and others who had suffered racism. I think it is important on National Indigenous Peoples Day that we celebrate, but also recognize the challenges. And so I thank you for that. So I think, as Valérie noted, I'm Christiane Fox, Deputy Minister of Indigenous Services Canada and the Deputy Minister Champion of the Federal Youth Network. Alors, Christiane Fox, je suis la sous-ministre responsable pour les services aux Autochtones du Canada et la sous-ministre championne du réseau des jeunes fonctionnaires fédéraux. I would like to acknowledge that I am on the land of the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I am honored to be able to be present on this land. Today's discussion is an important one, and I'd like to thank you all for being here to hear our panelists, their experiences, their stories, and their insights. And as we recognize National Indigenous History Month and National Indigenous Peoples Day, the beginning of summer solstice, it's just very timely that we're having this conversation today. These two webcasts are an important partnership between the Federal Youth Network and the Knowledge Circle for Indigenous Inclusion. And I've had the pleasure of working closely with both teams and with Deputy Minister Wilson as we try to coordinate our efforts and bring these two groups together. Alors, la discussion aujourd'hui est importante et j'aimerais vous remercier tous d'être ici pour écouter les expériences de nos panélistes, leurs histoires et leurs points de vue, alors que nous célébrons le mois national de l'histoire autochtone 2021 et aussi la Journée nationale des peuples autochtones, qui marque le début de solstice d'été. Alors, ces deux web émissions sont vraiment le fruit d'un partenariat important entre le réseau des jeunes fonctionnaires et aussi le Cercle du savoir sur l'inclusion autochtone. In my time at Indigenous Services Canada, I've been fortunate to hear the stories of our Indigenous public servants at all levels. With today's event, we'll hear from senior Indigenous leaders who have spent years, decades, challenging the system to open doors that were previously closed. They've opened up opportunities for new and young public servants. But we know that there's more to do. We know that there's more to do to improve the work culture for Indigenous public servants and to improve career opportunities for our Indigenous public servants as well. And I'm really here today to learn. Like, I felt it was important to be a part of this, to hear the various perspectives that are going to be shared. And as I think about how I can play my role as an ally to better support our Indigenous employees and how best to recruit Indigenous talent outside the public service, I can only do that if I hear from the voices of our panel and your voices. And I really do recognize the importance of better understanding the challenges and the system barriers in order to then be able to pivot and create that better work environment. Alors, depuis que j'ai commencé à travailler au service aux Autochtones Canada, j'ai eu la chance d'entendre les histoires de nos fonctionnaires autochtones à tous les niveaux. Et dans le cadre de l'événement aujourd'hui, nous entendrons des hauts dirigeants autochtones qui ont passé des années et des décennies à défier le système pour ouvrir des portes qui étaient auparavant fermées. Ils ont ouvert des opportunités pour les nouveaux et jeunes fonctionnaires, mais nous savons qu'il y a encore beaucoup de travail à faire. Nous savons qu'il y a encore beaucoup de possibilités d'amélioration, de changer la culture de notre travail pour ces fonctionnaires et pour nous tous. Alors moi, je suis ici aujourd'hui pour apprendre. Lors de mes réflexions de comment mieux appuyer nos employés autochtones et de recruter du talent autochtone de l'externe, c'est important pour moi comme dirigeante d'écouter nos panélistes aujourd'hui et vous tous, parce que je reconnais l'importance de mieux comprendre les défis, mieux comprendre les barrières systémiques qui existent encore afin de créer un environnement sain. So I really want to thank each one of our panelists for joining us. I want to thank you, each of you as participants, for joining to learn from the stories and experiences of our panel. And I think, you know, these lived experiences today, we can work together to build that better public service that we all want to see. And I'm now going to hand it off to our moderator for today's event, Valérie Guédillon. As I said earlier, I've only been in this department for 9 months. And I have learned from Valerie. I've learned from her dedication. I've learned from her passion. I've learned from her energy. And I think that we'll all benefit from her experience and others on this panel to be better. And I think that's ultimately what we want to do. Alors avec ça, je vais céder la parole à ma collègue Valérie et merci à vous tous.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Sous-Ministre. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to actually be a moderator this time and not a presenter or panelist. It's actually kind of a different role, but I'm looking forward to it. Really want to encourage people to use the chat function. I see people have started to do that already, talking about where they're from, and so funny to see Ron Crow from Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. Ron and I worked together at the Assembly of First Nations when he was the Associate Director of Health, and I won't say which year because it's going to date both of us, but I'm sure Ron looks younger every day. So it's just awesome to see the great diversity of talent of people that have connected today. Au lieu de juste dire les biographies de chacun des gens qui vont discuter aujourd'hui, vous pouvez les voir dans la fonction chat et donc ça va vous permettre de connaître un peu mieux les gens qui vont partager leurs expériences aujourd'hui. And I'm going to jump right into actually the Q&A session, and just to encourage, if you have a question that you'd like for me to ask the panelists, you can also use the Q&A function. And I saw that we already have a question, and you can even vote for your preferred question. So I'll be able to sort of go through a few introductory ones just to get our panelists warmed up, and then we'll tackle some of your hard questions in no time at all. I'm going to give each of the panelists an opportunity to sort of share what is their favorite career moment, what really stands out in their minds. And of course, if you want to do that from the perspective of being an Indigenous public servant, I think that would be great. So maybe we'll start with Patrick. Patrick, let's start with you.
Great, thanks, thanks, Valerie. And I too want to just start by thanking our elder, Michelle Smith, who I had the pleasure of working with back in the day at INAC, and also just to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from the unceded and beautiful traditional territory of the Algonquin people. And it seems like the sun's trying to poke through the clouds there, so that's encouraging. Yeah, no, I mean, I've been very blessed throughout my career, and I'm truly grateful for the various opportunities that I've had. You know, I think back to my time at the former INAC and working with Indigenous communities in community during my time there, and you know, whether it was on economic development projects or tripartite projects with provinces and communities, or education initiatives, or even social programming. You know, I think of my time at Public Safety Canada in national security, and, you know, a trip that I had in Israel where we were, you know, landing in the middle of the Mediterranean on a military helicopter on the Tamar rig, you know, which produces 80% of their energy for the entire country. I think of the times where I worked very closely with the families of the survivors of the Air India bombing of Flight 182, which was also very real and very touching. You know, when you have people crying on your shoulder, it makes it very real, very quick. I think of, you know, the work that I was very privileged to do over at Justice Canada in advocating and trying to advance the recognition of Indigenous rights, transforming the CBSA and their business model and how they deliver on their mandate. And quite honestly, even the last 2 months, the privilege that I've had to be working at Indigenous Services Canada and just being part of the amazing team that we have there in working with communities to really fight the pandemic, which is not over. We're not out of the woods yet by any means, but just that sense of being able to contribute to that and being able to be part of that, it has just been an amazing 2 months thus far. But I mean, really what it comes down to for me is all of the relationships that I've built, the people, right? And when you think back on I've been with the federal government for about 20 years now, and I think back on all of these projects or initiatives that I was part of, what really comes to mind very quickly is the people and the wonderful relationships that I've been able to build. Indigenous colleagues, employees, bosses that I've seen grow throughout the public service, and really rise to the occasion and be there to create that sense of community within the public service. To me, that's what it all comes down to at the end of the day. So been very fortunate, and I'm really appreciative of those opportunities to work with fantastic people. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. We'll turn it over to Anna Fontaine. Anna.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay.
Sorry, Anna, I can't hear you.
Uh-oh. I have it off mute.
No,
You're very quiet.
You were off mute. You just were very quiet.
I'm not sure why. Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, there we go. Maybe it was my mic. Sorry, apologize for that, guys.
Oh, you're still low. Sorry, you were good for about a minute.
I want to thank, can you hear me now? I won't move.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Anna. Maybe you can take your earphones off if possible. If it's okay with you, I'll go to...
Take my headphones off.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Here, I'll just take my headphones off and hopefully you won't hear the twins running in the background. So my apologies, folks, for that. I want to thank Michelle for his beautiful prayer. I've really come to know Michelle in my work at the Knowledge Circle for Indigenous inclusion, and he really is such a guiding force for us there. So thank you very much for that beautiful prayer. I'm coming to you today from Regina, Saskatchewan. I'd like to welcome you to Treaty 4 territory. I'm, and my biography says they're going to be put up in the chat, says I come from Star Blanket Cree Nation here in Saskatchewan, so I'm very close to home here. And I've been very fortunate to work with First Nation communities the majority of my career. And when I was thinking back on my most memorable career moments, I have to say there's quite a few. I had the opportunity, like Patrick was saying, the traveling sometimes, depending on your position where you get to go. I was able to travel to Australia to represent the department at the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education, and seeing all of those Indigenous educators. And I'm an educator, that's my background. And seeing them from all around the world, it was truly amazing. And it really stood out to me, and the importance of learning through culture and connection to the land really stood out. But I thought, considering the Audience Federal Youth Network, I thought maybe there's one with a little bit of humor I'd like to share. And that was when I was a Regional Director General in Manitoba, where ministerial trips were always filled with anticipation, but also some very extreme nervousness, because we never knew how they were going to go, whether there was going to be a protest or whether we would end up in the news, or if it was going to be positive or negative. You could never predict them. So one particular ministerial trip stuck with me, and I call it Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And for those of you who are younger and may not have seen this, it's in relation to a movie with the same name with a Canadian iconic star, John Candy. So if you haven't seen it, I urge you to check it out. So Minister Strahl was coming to our region for a 2-day trip, visiting several communities and meeting with chief and councils and other stakeholders. As our communities there are a fair distance, we have to plan these trips very carefully, making sure that we can maximize where he goes to. So for this particular one, though, this day we had booked a float plane. It was the first time we had booked a float plane, and actually the last time we booked one with this particular company. We were all waiting at where the float plane was supposed to be, and we were supposed to board, and the pilot wasn't there. So he didn't show up for like an hour. He was over an hour late. When he finally did show up and got us into the plane, we were all buckled in, and I was sitting behind the minister, and the pilot turned around and he said to me, "So where are we off to today?" Well, you can imagine my stomach dropped, and I was looking at him like, "What do you mean, where are we going today?" So a lot of phone calls and back and forth, and we eventually got in the air, and he knew exactly where we were going and where he was taking us to. Thankfully, Minister Strahl's a bush pilot, and he was able to adapt quickly to it, and he didn't have any issues with anything. But when we got back into town, we were already behind because we were late getting to the community. So we were behind a good 2 hours at this point. And when we got to the car and we were at the float plane base, which was out of the city and off the beaten path, we sat down in the car and we go to start it and the engine's dead. And I'm like, oh, seriously? So we ended up, Minister Strahl took it all in stride, took off his sport coat, laid it on the fence, and then pulled up the hood and waved down a vehicle to come and boost the vehicle. In the meantime, I'm frantically on my BlackBerry trying to reschedule meetings, trying to see if we could postpone any and letting them know we we're going to be late. And of course, with Chief and Council, they insisted that we meet. And so what we did was we said, okay, well, let's take a back road here. Let's go not take the main drag so we don't get stuck in traffic, and we'll try to get there as quick as we can. Well, what ended up happening was we go through this small town and probably hit the only train that goes through there in a week. And it's like a 10-minute long prairie train. It's like not one of those short ones. So I was like, are you serious? So again, we were late. At the end though, we ended up getting in all the meetings. He met with everybody he was supposed to meet with. And from that, and the message I want you to know is that when you're working with our communities and when you're working in general with communities, that no matter how hard you plan, no matter what contingencies you put in place, things can still go off the rails. But if you can adjust, if you can adapt, it'll happen the way it's supposed to. And minister, and Cloud was great in the end, but I was sure glad, and I always was glad when he waved goodbye and walked through. So that's it.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry, you were breaking up there a little bit at the end, but I think we definitely got the gist of the story. Which is that you need to have a minister who's a bush pilot. I'm not sure if Minister Miller would have been able to do that, but hopefully. But that's pretty awesome. I'm pretty sure Minister Bennett could do anything at all. I'm pretty sure. So I'm going to turn it over to our third panelist, and really looking forward to their story as well. Tuni Julie Orello. If you would like to go ahead and share one of your most interesting career moments.
Unusakut kuviasupunga tabani kataugama Tuni Julie kutu shuralongyunga tamani arwami tamani tunga nuna hakak simajui ulongani kuviasulagi punga. Hi, Tuni Julie Kutu Shirello here. I'm really pleased to be joining all of you here virtually. I would also like to acknowledge Elder Michelle Smith for your beautiful words and really starting us off on a beautiful footing. Also want to acknowledge the fellow panelists and our youth and the young professionals around here as we gather to really pause, reflect, and celebrate Indigenous cultures here in the Federal Public Service and nationally. I'm a director with the RCMP Indigenous Collaboration, Coordination, and Accountability. I'm quite new here. I've been here a few weeks. I came from ESDC, Employment and Social Development Canada. I joined the Federal Public Service after spending almost a decade with Inuit Tapiri Kanatami, the Inuit organization here in Ottawa. So looking at this question, Valerie, I was thinking, I feel very fortunate to be able to reflect on a few very positive career moments. And as I reflected on this morning, I thought, You know, over the last few years, when we've really been looking at mobilizing the federal public service on responding to reconciliation, it brought me to Employment and Social Development Canada when I joined the HR team, Human Resources, to really look at how we could advance reconciliation within the human resources front. So I'm going to share that experience. So when we looked at reconciliation in a human lens, we also incorporated a cultural component to it, a cultural component that would recognize First Nations, Inuit, Métis within our workplace. So as we created a reconciliation strategy, that input and the strategy was also defined from input from our stakeholders, our partners, from the Indigenous communities. So that really allowed us an opportunity to really look at a strategy that would address systematic barriers around language, around education, around experience, and also what we would do as a department to truly celebrate Indigenous peoples. So throughout the strategy and the creation of it, we created the first ever Indigenous HR team, Indigenous recruitment, advancement team in ESDC. So that allowed us the opportunity, and this is where it really reflected on me as one of the best career moments, is really going into the communities to promote the department of an employer of choice for First Nations, Inuit, Métis, with a specific focus on youth and young professionals. Throughout this engagement, we saw ourselves in academia, we saw ourselves in community centers, organizations, and that resulted in a 33% increase throughout one fiscal year. So I think, again, looking at the federal public service and the ability for Indigenous peoples to consider us as an employer of choice, and having allies and friendships across those borders and all the partners was one of those significant moments where I felt really proud. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And really linked to the other next question that has been top rated so far in terms of the Q&A. So maybe I'll invite Anna to share her thoughts. We have someone who's asking, so they're hiring. They want to know what they can learn about the Indigenous experience that will allow them to adapt their process in terms of also being more aware in terms of the non-Indigenous community of their own biases, so that they can be more welcoming and really support Indigenous employees that would be joining their team. So do you have any recommendations, Anna, that you would share on that point?
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I think when I was preparing for this, for messaging, that I really wanted to think about the diversity and inclusion aspect of what's really become a priority. And I hope you can hear me now. I tried to move the laptop up closer. So, and part of that for me is really about diversity and having real inclusion, so that when you're thinking of doing your staffing plans and doing your hiring, try to look really at where your biases might come into play. And one of the things I do talk about is the myth of meritocracy. And when you look at a statement of merit, with all things being equal, of course, going through an equal process for everybody should result in getting you the most eligible candidate or the best candidate at the end of the day, but they aren't. And so when you look at the merit and you say, well, I'm going to do all of these steps and follow them very specifically, and therefore it'll be equal and fair to everybody, it truly isn't. And because everybody's coming from a different starting point. So when you're taking that aspect into consideration, it's truly important to make sure that you're looking at each stage. As the audit indicated, there are certain stages where different equity groups, as well as Indigenous people, are not getting through the stages, in particular at the interview stage. So maybe really look at that and evaluate, how are you doing your interviews? How are they structured? And the HR process, unfortunately, is a very colonialistic based process. but I have heard from many HR specialists in the last little while saying, we really want to be supported in doing things differently. And I've seen posters coming out that are different and more flexible. People have been coming to the Knowledge Circle and asking for our input. So when you're looking at biases and doing that, please take a look and ask if you don't know and reach out. But the other piece to the inclusion is once you do hire somebody that's Indigenous or is from one of the employment equity groups and you're looking at diversity, then include them at the table in the conversation. When I first started in the public service, I was fortunate enough to join at the time when Gathering Strength was around, and that really dates me after RCAP. And so our voices were actually really heard. I felt really heard when I joined the department, and it really made a difference to me staying. So for managers to the importance of making them feel welcome, making Indigenous employees feel like their voice matters, and creating a well-being in the workplace that will allow them to stay, because we're pretty good at recruitment, but if you're not creating workplace wellness and making it a space for Indigenous voices, then they will leave.
Thank you very much, Anna. Very much appreciated. Patrick, one of the questions that is highest rated is something that I think you can help us out with in terms of the great diversity that you've had in your career. What would have been some supports or services that you think would have been helpful to you as an Indigenous public servant that you may not have had or that you did receive and that you felt really helped you to support your career development and progression?
Yeah, no, that's it's very important, and I think everybody on an individual basis will have a different journey, right? They'll have their own journey through the public service, and some of them are coming in from, Indigenous organizations. Some might be coming in from provincial government. Some might be coming in from, the private sector, which personally was my experience working up in Sudbury and then coming into the federal government in 2001. For me, right from the get-go, I was surrounded by a team of Indigenous people, right? So coming in, I felt right away, I felt at home. I did not feel alone. Worked on, for example, the Aboriginal Workforce Participation Initiative, the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business, where the teams were predominantly made up of Indigenous people. And that differs. I mean, when I think of other colleagues and discussions that I've had with them where they came in and felt totally isolated, right? Felt like they totally, like, I don't belong here. And I don't see myself in this organization. I don't have a voice, let alone a seat at the table. So for me, that was very important to be able to, find that connection, find that sense of community. So, if you are a young, professional coming into the public service, and you might feel alone, is seek out those networks, right? Because I think it's so important in terms of that sense of community, that sense of belonging. Another thing that was very important for me was, mentorship, and it doesn't have to be formal, right? It doesn't have to always be, the HR program and you fill out this form and this and that. It's seek out informal mentors as well, right? Because it really comes down to connecting. You got to click with your mentor, right? If not, it in my experience anyhow, it's not effective. So I was very fortunate to find, one or two mentors who I really clicked with, really connected with. And I think most importantly, who I trusted, right? To really be able to open up and share and talk about, where I was going and what I was seeing and questions that I might have as a new public servant in the federal system. So for me, that was very important as well. Then when I think of, as I got further on in my career, like the leadership development programs, I was able to benefit from them. I'm in one right now, the ELDP, which I'm greatly benefiting from. So it's, that comes down to me, that comes down to sponsorship, right? Is having someone, that's able to connect with, and this is different than mentorship, right? But someone that's able to sort of take you under their wing and sort of be there for you as a resource, to really champion you, right? To be able to advocate for you as an individual, understanding the potential that you have and whatnot, and your strengths and your weaknesses. That was very important to me as well. So, I would encourage anybody, no matter where you are in your career, a brand new public servant, been in the system for 5, 10, 20, 25 years, I would really encourage that. So find your sense of belonging, and that's through community. And there's networks out there, so seek them out. Mentorship and sponsorship and development opportunities is the way to go, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you very much for that, Patrick. Toonie Julie, I have a question. It's something that I haven't heard before, but there's someone who's asking about when you're open about being an Indigenous person in government and you're being solicited often by non-Indigenous colleagues to sort of ask you for advice or, ask you for help or assistance. And, how do you balance that, or how do you set boundaries so that you're not constantly sort of having to do this and on top of your job, plus also potentially being placed in a position where you might be sharing more about your personal life or your personal views than where you feel comfortable. And I think the individuals talked about it in terms of emotional labor. If you have any advice for people, and I hear that all the time, right? Like people say, God, I'm so tired about like being the Indigenous expert in the team, I'm just wondering if you have any advice for those employees.
Right. Thank you for that. I think it's an important question, and it's something I too have heard in my various capacities, particularly over the last few years as we've had very dedicated efforts to really look at advancing reconciliation within the public service and outside as well. I think there are many colleagues, many allies who are genuinely interested and very eager to learn about some of the barriers associated with an inclusive workforce that includes First Nations, Inuit, Métis. I think it's important to ensure that as departments, we have processes in place, networks in place, committees in place that are positioned to help navigate and mobilize these types of inquiries to ensure that our colleagues are well supported in making informed decisions. One of the things that I have heard through dialogue with Indigenous communities is, there are positions of authority within the federal public service that can really influence policies and programs that impact Canadians, including the citizens of First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities. So creating space for Indigenous peoples within these tables, as well as we articulate and create a narrative that is fully inclusive. So for me personally and professionally, I've always taken great pride to help foster relationships with Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous peoples, other employment equity groups. And being involved in the community, I think also positions all of us to create that partnership, that friendship, that allyship. And I like to take pauses, Valerie and colleagues here, when I think about sharing information. Is a very strong guidance that we receive in our Inuit culture. And one of them is entitled which means being welcoming and inclusive. So I think that's a really big trait that I also incorporate in my business practice as well when I'm sharing. The other aspect that I also encourage when I get inquiries about particularly the Inuit community where I come from is also me taking that moment to learn about the Western processes and what that looks like and how we can incorporate and make that alignment. So then it's really co-development. So I think taking those moments and ensuring that our staff, our colleagues are well positioned with the right information and that they too feel confident as they learn. Kuyanami. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was just excellent. Anna, we have a tough question, but I think you can handle it because I know you've faced a lot of tough questions in your career. I think it's with everything that is happening and everything that is in the media and the public domain right now with respect to the trauma that Indigenous peoples have experienced. How do you manage, discussions with other Indigenous members of the community about the fact that you work in the federal government and that we sort of carry that legacy? And I have to say, I find throughout my career, it's become even more increasingly difficult for me to actually see media reports that are really critical of the department and the public service, just because over the course of my career, I've met so many amazing public service that are so dedicated, Indigenous and allies. And so, I feel for the misrepresentation that I feel about all of their commitment and their dedication, and it creates a lot of pain, that I carry all the time. And so, I think it's difficult and sometimes really intimidating for Indigenous people to join the public service, or even non-Indigenous people to join the public service in an Indigenous department, because they're concerned about how to manage those difficult situations. Do you have any advice from your years of experience about how to manage those conversations, especially now?
That really is a loaded question. Actually, there's so much to it packed in there. Just from a couple of different perspectives on it. When I joined the federal government, it was a really hard choice for me to do that. My mother and my family in general did not have a good view of the government. And for a lot of First Nation people, Indian Affairs is considered government. So they don't worry about any of the other departments. It's all about Indian Affairs. So when I said to my family, I'm joining Indian Affairs, it was kind of like, you're what? You're going to the dark side? What do you mean? And so I came on through an interchange. And I came on at a time when there was a real drive to promote and recruit and hire First Nations people within the department. And I've known Patrick for many years too. And I was brought in to do the procurement strategy for Aboriginal business. So it was a real positive way to kind of come in. And so I remember feeling like, well, I don't really have a voice now. I'm here and it's so challenging. And I was at a promotional event and I tell people this story about Gary McLean, and anybody who knows who Gary McLean is, he's one of the drivers behind the day school settlement. And I didn't know who he was at the time. And he was sitting with a newspaper in the back of the room. And I was saying, somebody was complaining about the policies and process. And I said, well, I'm just an officer. I don't really have any influence on that. And I can't really do anything about that. And he came back and he put his newspaper down and he said, well, if you think you can't do anything about it, then you shouldn't be working where you are. And it really, after I talked to him about it too, it really has stuck with me that I always believe no matter what, we all have a voice. But the challenging part for us as public servants is that dichotomy of being a First Nations person and our values around that and our beliefs, and then coming into the public service and having to manage, in particular, those departments or frontline departments that deal with enforcement. It's so challenging to implement these archaic policies, or sometimes a government that's putting out a political stance or position that you don't necessarily agree with. And that's, especially if you're a long-serving career public servant, comes and goes. Change always happens. So it is really, really difficult. And part of the other problem is around when you have a time like we had today, or not today, sorry, in the last couple of weeks that is impacting us, and a day like today, where you were still carrying a lot of trauma around that. It hasn't always been a place where we could have a safe space to have the conversation amongst each other. So we at the Knowledge Circle have really tried to do that in the last little while. And when we're talking about Indigenous well-being strategies, talking with other Indigenous employees and saying, what would it look like to you to have a safe workplace? And we just recently compiled a lot of that together and sent it out to the people who participated to influence the change we need to have with federal wellness programming, coming in line with it, but also saying, but what else? You know, the regular programming isn't necessarily a great fit for us. What else do we need in those supports? And a big thing is trauma-informed managers too. Managers come in and they're trained how to manage people. They don't necessarily think about the well-being of the people, even though right now it's become really important. And so they are doing it. They may not be trained on how to deal with trauma. And not that they have to actually be trained to be psychologists, but at least be trained to know where to assist them to help to get them help, or even to know that the response maybe isn't necessarily about the work or about things at work. It could be what's influencing and impacting them, especially for people in the last few weeks, and how us as Indigenous employees are feeling. And then working with EAP even in making sure that they have an Indigenous stream that allows people to connect with the type of therapy, the type of counselors that they can relate to. So they're not educating them on a whole bunch of history when they're coming to the table, and that time is dedicated for their wellness. So I hope I addressed some of what you asked. It was quite a bit. I was trying to take a few notes.
Absolutely, Anna. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think, Patrick, there's a similar but not quite the same question about if you're an Indigenous person and you're coming into a department that sometimes may have more tense relationships with the Indigenous community, such as in policing or corrections, but it could be our department as well. How do you manage that as an Indigenous person in terms of establishing that trust relationship with a community?
Yeah, it's not easy. That's for sure. And I'll just use an example. My time at Justice Canada, right, where we were really pushing to change the law, right? And this is in an institution that's known for, defending the federal government's position on these laws, for the last 150 years. And it was really a mindset, right? Where people are doing their jobs and they're defending the federal posture, but really going in there to try and change that posture. And that was very difficult, I'll be very honest. But it takes a lot of perseverance. And just going back to, the answer I provided on that other question about, what's worked for me and what supported me throughout my career, it was that outlet, that ability to go back to, to recharge with, fellow Indigenous public servants, right? The networks that existed, confiding in not only colleagues, but friends, really, going to my mentors and having those hard conversations to stay grounded, right? And to continue to persevere. So I think it's difficult, but it's absolutely doable. And then gaining that trust, what I call street cred, right, with the communities, I think is so important. And communities, like anybody else, I mean, they'll see right through it if you're not authentic. Whether you're an employee, you're trying to sell something to your employees, or working with communities or whatnot, like you have to be authentic. If not, people will see right through that, and you'll never gain that trust. And that's so important, I think, for any of this work to happen. If you cannot establish a trust relationship, and trust relationship doesn't mean you'll always agree, right? But if you're not able to create that trust relationship, I'm not convinced you'll be successful in moving forward your mandate and what you're trying to achieve there. So staying grounded, going back, staying connected, going to your mentors, to seek advice. And it's okay. It's okay not to have all the answers, right? But building that trust relationship with the communities, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I would complement what you've said also from the perspective that sometimes as strong a relationship as you have, you also have to remember that, community leaders are politicians. And, sometimes they will say things in the public domain that is not necessarily reflective of the integrity of the relationship that the public service has with the community. And it's always important to distinguish that, the same way that we would distinguish what federal ministers would say in a public domain versus what they may say when we're providing them with advice. It's the same thing. And I think sometimes
Absolutely.
people don't necessarily recognize that there's a distinction there, and take it really hard when community leadership will say to a federal minister, well, you haven't, and you're like, well, but I have such a strong trust relationship with the community. You absolutely do. This is a political conversation. And it's something you learn with probably too many years of experience, hopefully pretty quickly. But thank you for
Absolutely.
that. Tuni, Julie, we have questions about, and you spoke about it when you were talking about, one of your greatest sort of career successes or experiences that you had, but people are really curious to know sort of if you were building an Indigenous talent plan, either for an individual or a group of Indigenous employees, what are some of the core success factors that you would want to see included in that to build their talent?
Right. When we really look at the definition of core success factors, I think when we look at the Indigenous lens, it always goes down and really has a big alignment to HR planning. And when we promote the public service as an employer of choice, one of the critical elements is really seeking input from our partners. When we look at creating a strategy that is intended to be inclusive, reflective of First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples within this context, what are some of the processes we need to consider? There are mechanisms that I really believe have worked in the future, can continue to work, is creating formal partnerships with organizations to help shape our HR planning, HR policies, HR processes. Anna spoke about that really well when she spoke about some of the processes in terms of language and posters, job posters. So I think incorporating that input we're seeking from community is very important. And we also need to look at our own diversity and inclusion plans as a government to really also shape and also recognize that there are many diverse groups, recognizing that even within Indigenous community, that there are diverse groups coast to coast to coast. The other area is really looking at some of the employee experiences by analyzing data that's provided to us through survey tools, survey instruments, community gatherings to really understand what employees need from us as employers to help shape their careers. We also have an opportunity to really look at, and Patrick spoke to it a couple times in terms of mentorship and coaching and what that relationship really looks like. One of the areas I've heard of, Valerie, is ensuring that when we look at retention of employees, that we have an opportunity to incorporate cultures in our workplace. That can be achieved through engagement with elders, knowledge keepers, youth, and really seeing communities within our workplace. One example I'd also like to share when we talk about retention and advancement is it may not seem like a regular workforce example, but there was one opportunity we had during Indigenous Peoples Day, probably a couple of years ago or so in my former department, where we brought in country food for Inuit employees. And one of the messaging there must have been about a dozen of us. One of the messaging and the feedback we got was, never did they think or realize that they'd be in a boardroom in a federal government department, enjoying their food, sitting with colleagues, and really being able to showcase and share their culture. So I really believe when we look at that piece, that it also has to include a cultural safety attachment to it.
Thank you so much. Anna, I think we've had a couple of questions that are all linked to language. And I know the Knowledge Center has been doing some work around exploring what might be a more inclusive approach to language in the public service. recognizing that we have the Official Languages Act in the public service, and that for many executive positions in the government or even non-executive positions in the government, knowing both official languages is a key requirement. Knowing that that has created, absolutely without question, a barrier for Indigenous peoples to advance in the public service. And I would say, added to that, I know we talk about how to recognize Indigenous languages in the public service, but also Indigenous peoples who don't speak either the other official language or their own Indigenous languages. Is there at risk that they're even going to be even more marginalized? So maybe you could just sort of more broadly speak to the issue of language and what might be, it might be a bit early because I know the work is happening now, but maybe some early thoughts about adapting sort of our approaches to language to be able to support Indigenous recruitment and retention and advancement.
Yeah, this is a difficult one because I've been a part of the Official Languages Working Group and for almost a year now, and so much work was done way before that by the Indigenous Federal Employees Network and then other Indigenous employees leading up to the work that we're doing today. But there is a recognition through the Official Languages Modernization Act in there that recognizes Indigenous employees and the need to have a differentiated approach there to support them. And all of that is tied, of course, into reconciliation. And one of the challenges, I think, for Indigenous employees that have to take language training in either French or English, because I think there's always an assumption that it's only about taking the French language training. It's not. Our Indigenous Francophone colleagues have the same challenges, and in some cases even greater, because there's so many more positions that require English as an essential language, and that's not their first language. In some cases, it's their third language. So, and when you look at those having to train that, it brings back some real trauma for people going through that training and the frustration around, I've lost my language because the government took it away by putting my parents in residential school. They didn't pass the language on to me, or my grandparents, whatever the case may be, and I can't speak it today because of the government. And now they're forcing me to learn a colonial language. And I understand that. I've been through French language training. I've had those traumatic thoughts myself and gone through that, and had those awful days where I was just like, am I ever going to get through this? And it was a real challenge, I think, for me. And I think that's what a lot of us feel, because we go through as well doing our jobs, and we do them really well, and we're good at our jobs. We create relationships. We do so with so much passion and effort. And then we have to go off on language training, and you feel like, the anxiety around failure around that too, because it's not that you are a failure, it's that there could be a mental block. There's all kinds of reasons, in fact, why you would get there. So I just wanted to acknowledge that piece actually exists there. But on the other hand, from my perspective, I also look at it as a need for my job. I look at it as something that I want to have, that I want to be able to speak French, to speak with my colleagues. I've tried to take the other piece out of it in order for me to be able to be the best public servant I can be from my perspective. I don't put that on anybody else, though. That's me and how I see it. As part of the Official Languages group, there's so many differing viewpoints around how we should approach this. But one of the things we have come clearly down to is really saying that you have to have the ability to have flexibility. And even though currently right now the flexibility sometimes exists in directives or policies, it's not necessarily being followed across all departments. So we would say, first and foremost, utilize the flexibility you have. And lately we've seen posters out there for very senior levels for English Essential, and that's fantastic. So, but at the end of the day, what is that flexibility to get them to that stage where they need to have the French language training when you're talking about senior levels? And can we have some flexibility in there when we're talking about the Official Languages Act, and how can that come down to policies and directives? And a part of that too is for each individual to have the opportunity to take the path they want to take. So for those that want to take the language, that they're not penalized if there's an exemption, that they be allowed to take the French language training and saying, well, no, we're not going to give you French language training because you're exempted. So why should we invest in you? And then the other key thing I just want to highlight and say is the importance around testing and language training. It's so hard, and it's not just for Indigenous people, but my Western colleagues will say as well, when you're in the West and you haven't grown up around French and you're expected to learn that language here in the absence of being able to speak it, it becomes a real challenge. So we have to change the way we do training, invest in it, and allow those who aren't exposed to it, haven't grown up with it, that chance to learn language the way everybody else does when they're children, by hearing it first, by speaking it, not by grammar and reading and writing, the backwards way that we do it now. Anyway, I hope I addressed it to a certain extent. It's so challenging because we're kind of in the middle. So we will be coming forward though very shortly with some considerations for you both.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the heads up. And I look forward to it. But I thought there were so many questions on this issue, and you're ideally positioned to be able to do the best as anybody could in terms of speaking to this issue. Patrick, on va faire une question en français, justement, pour essayer d'avoir un petit peu plus d'équilibre. Une question que je voudrais te poser, c'est si tu regardes ta progression de carrière, puis tu te remets comme dans ta jeunesse, pas que tu es loin de la jeunesse, là, mais juste pour dire, tu es peut-être plus loin que tu étais il y a 10 ans. Quels seraient comme les conseils que tu donnerais pour comment est-ce que tu as pu avancer dans ta carrière? So my question to Patrick is, going back to his younger self, what advice would he give about how he was able to progress in his career, which is one of the questions that we have that was posed to us. Alors, Patrick?
Oui, c'est une bonne question. Puis, je pense que c'est différentes affaires ensemble, jumelées ensemble, qui m'ont vraiment aidé durant ma carrière. Puis, je dirais qu'une des choses, que je donnerais comme conseil, c'est implique-toi. Implique-toi dans ton ministère, implique-toi dans ton secteur, dans ta direction générale. Tu sais, fais pas arriver au bureau et dire, ben moi, ma job, là, c'est de ça à ça, puis c'est rien que ça que je vais faire. Tu sais, c'est ton milieu de travail. Tu sais, on passe tellement d'heures dans une semaine au bureau en travaillant. Tu sais, might as well make it your home. Tu sais. Donc, implique-toi, que ce soit des réseaux, que ce soit des initiatives spéciales, toutes les opportunités qui te passent où tu peux lever ta main et dire I'll take that on. Je pense que ça m'a aidé non seulement à mieux comprendre la fonction publique puis comment que ça fonctionne, parce que des fois, je trouve que ça peut être très difficile à comprendre, mais pourquoi ils allent de cette direction-là ou pourquoi ils font ça. Donc, ça donne une meilleure aperçu. Puis, je pense qu'aussi, ça donne une meilleure aperçu de la perspective de toutes les choses qui se passent au fédéral. C'est immense quoi qu'on fait comme fonction publique. Puis souvent, puis je pense que c'est Tony qui l'a mentionné tantôt, c'est souvent les employés autochtones, ils pensent que, well, I have INAC. On va aller travailler aux affaires autochtones, puis c'est que ça. Tu sais, moi, j'aimerais ça voir un jour où on a de la représentativité autochtone dans tous les ministères. Tu sais, c'est sûr, oui, aux affaires autochtones, dans nos ministères là, où on travaille, mais aussi tous les ministères. Tu sais, donc, ça va pas, je pense, ça va pas se faire tout seul. Je pense qu'il faut s'impliquer. Il faut regarder au-delà de l'horizon pour voir, mais c'est quoi qui se passe là-bas. Puis, tu sais, je suis un peu curieux, puis je vais aller me mettre le nez là-dedans, puis voir quoi qui se passe. Établir des connexions, des réseaux. Encore, ça fait une couple de fois que je le dis. Les réseaux autochtones, les réseaux, même non autochtones, sont très importants pour être capable de mieux comprendre quoi qui se passe puis de t'impliquer dans des initiatives. Moi, j'ai eu l'opportunité à plusieurs reprises durant ma carrière de m'impliquer dans des initiatives qui faisaient absolument rien à faire avec ma job. OK? Parce que c'était des initiatives au niveau de la fonction publique, que ce soit Many Voices, One Mind, comme exemple, où ça m'a donné l'opportunité de vraiment foncer, puis de vraiment élargir mes réseaux, élargir l'opportunité de démontrer quoi je pouvais faire comme fonctionnaire. Donc, j'encourage tout le monde sur l'appel de vous impliquer. Get out of your lane. Don't just stay in your lane. Get involved, puis fonce. And don't let up. Parce que ça ne va pas se faire tout seul. You have to will it to change. Donc, n'hésite pas de t'impliquer, puis lâche pas.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And I can just sort of say, your points that you've made about networking, and we have a couple of questions about, I'm working in a finance sector. I'm not really involved in the kind of like frontline type of Indigenous priorities, but I want to contribute. And I think, like Indigenous employee networks used to be, that's an INAC thing, or that's a FNIB thing, right? But it's not, right? And I think the Knowledge Center has demonstrated really helped to make connections across federal departments. There are interdepartmental Indigenous employee networks at various levels. We even have a group we've started at the deputy ADM's level, but it's across the board. And the Knowledge Center is there to, and Anak, I'm sure would be helpful to connect people to network contacts that they can connect with, including, I know we have a question about how to find a mentor, and I'm sure that there's a Mentorship Plus initiative that is being really broadened across departments. It's just started. Not all departments are included yet, but it really is intended to promote diversity and inclusion and support mentorship across the various intersectional communities as well, and to provide that specific lens and focus in terms of mentorship. So that is really growing as an opportunity across the public service as well. So thank you for that advice. Tuni, Julie, I think one of the questions that we had, which is a very important one, is how to balance your commitment in the public service to the commitment that you have for your community. And I would say family and community is so integrated often. It's hard to tell the difference between one and the other, at least in my world, and I'm sure in many of yours. Do you have any advice for particularly younger public servants about how to maintain that balance?
Yeah, when we look at balancing our own experiences in the communities and how we incorporate those lived experiences in the workplace, I think it's two different worlds, absolutely. But in the same breath, that is part of the public service we want to see is comprised of diverse experiences, diverse cultures. So finding that opportunity to share your culture in your organization, again, whether through networks or committees, but also having that confidence to still be active participants within your own communities outside of work by participating on health boards, education boards. For example, I've had the pleasure of sitting on boards that advance and look at children and youth in creating safe spaces for them, or health boards. So continuing to stay engaged in your own culture and keeping that identity, I think is really critical. And also one of my commitments that I'm continuously promoting in my own household through families who are non-Inuit, non-Indigenous, is encouraging us to have conversations on the realities of my people, Inuit, First Nations, Inuit, Métis. So continuing those conversations and taking those opportunities, also celebrating culture in and outside of the workplace. I think as a public service, one of the great opportunities we have is really incorporating cultural awareness, cultural safety in the organization through the creation of cultural centers such as Kumik within your departments. I think that's an excellent example. So it's finding that balance, but always ensuring that you feel confident to walk into your organization with your culture and sharing that as well.
Thank you very much for that. Anna, there's a question about how do you mentor or support Indigenous public servants? I'm sure you've done that in the course of your career in many different ways. What's your approach to it? If somebody comes to you and says, can you help me? Do you have any advice to give me? Are you able to mentor me? What does that mean? And how do you go about doing that with someone?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if it's our nature, or I do believe actually it's our nature as Indigenous public servants, as Indigenous people, as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, is to connect and gravitate to each other. And fortunately, that provides us a natural kind of process in many cases to link in with others who have been around the public service for a while, to be able to reach out to connect with them. So I have spent a lot of my career mentoring and speaking with and talking to, and have been mentored by some very fantastic Indigenous senior leaders and non-Indigenous, because I think it's really important that you look at what Patrick said about broadening your experience. It's so important to be purposeful. So if you're looking at your career, like I look at my career and I look back and I say, ugh, I didn't plan it. It happened to me. I fell into almost everything. And if I could go back, I would say plan your career. Make sure that you're looking at where do you want to be? Where do you see yourselves? We have the career pathways, and we're also going to be posting from KC the roadmap, the career roadmap. Take a look at that. It gives you opportunities, whether you're starting out as a public servant, if you want to be a manager, if you want to be an executive. Plan it. Take the learning that you need to do. Connect with the people you need to connect with, or if you want to get into a specific field of study, that's so important. And the other thing I say now all the time when I talk to young Indigenous public servants is protect yourself and your health. Don't come in, or any public servants coming in. Busyness is busyness. And it's that, like, look at what you're measuring in your outcomes. What do you want to achieve? Having 15 meetings, it doesn't necessarily produce any outcomes. So think about, what do you want to actually achieve when you're purposeful? What goals do you want to reach? And take care of yourself and health. Understand who you are as a public servant, because I was working at one point 70-hour weeks, or more. And I slept with my BlackBerry beside me, thinking no one else could do my job. I have to be there. I have to answer that phone. I have to do this. And you know what? When I walked away, it was all fine. I mean, that, and the thing is that what wasn't fine was my health. And that was from years of dedicating so much of myself to my job. I forgot to have that balance between my emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental wellness. And for me, when that got out of whack, I got out of whack. And so now that I've brought it back and been able to reconnect with that and understand that importance of balance, I have 8 grandchildren, a 9th one on the way. My most important role is as a cookum. And I tell everybody that. My job is important, but my family always will come first to me. So just try to remember when you're planning your career to remember that balance and not understand who you are. Try to be self-aware as much as possible, because when change happens, then you're able to go with the flow.
I'm so glad that you spoke to that, Anna, because I think that creating an inclusive and culturally safe environment also means respecting boundaries and ensuring that people are not making personal sacrifices every single minute of the day to contribute to the public service, right? There has to be some degree of balance, even though it's the hit and miss sometimes, and let's all be frank about that. But I think being mindful and being self-aware of the extent to which you are keeping those boundaries sort of maintained is extremely important, especially as you grow older, people. Sometimes when wisdom comes too late. So it's important to try to start out and listen to the wisdom of others. I have a question I think I'll start with Toonie Julie, but I would like Patrick to comment on this as well, and then we'll probably close our session with Michelle. But, I think we have a question that was posed about sort of essentially a comment that you all seem so confident about who you are as an Indigenous person. And, not everyone has had the privilege in a way of growing up sort of knowing who they are or who their history or what their history was. And, you know, there are many Indigenous people who grew up without it being talked about for various reasons relating to trauma. Sometimes also people were taken away from their family and community, placed in the Child and Family Services system, as we all know from the 60s scoop and other impacts. But they are proud of who they are, and they are proud of their roots. They just are having more of a challenge in terms of connecting to their history. Do you have any advice for those individuals? And I would just also add, you know, there is quite unfortunately lateral violence also among Indigenous peoples across the country, not just within the public service. And I've certainly encountered in my career Indigenous people that have felt that they couldn't say that they were Indigenous because they either didn't look Indigenous enough, or they didn't speak their language, or perhaps they had that disconnection from community, which is not their doing. I don't know if there's any words of wisdom that you could share for those individuals that are listening today.
This is a very important question. You know, when earlier I spoke about the various groups, First Nations, Inuit, Métis groups, and even within those groups, I mean, we get into communities, reserve, urban areas. Even in the Inuit world, there are 4 different regions. My advice is to always remain curious about where you come from. And don't be nervous or afraid to reach out, even when the space doesn't seem that secure. Finding those allies, finding those friendships, and finding that pride of where your people come from. I would also say that it takes patience to learn about your own culture, whether it's the Indigenous culture or other areas, but to really exercise patience. I'm going to share a personal experience. I have a friend in the Federal Public Service who learned about his culture at a later age. And we agreed, based on friendship, based on trust, that we would work together and help teach each other and help give that guidance. So I think as Indigenous peoples, at least in my perspective, that if I feel more confident and equipped and that I was raised in my culture, it's also my responsibility to share that with others who are in a learning journey. I also think that as a federal public service, that we have that opportunity to support employees who are learning about their culture by supporting their navigation and mobilizing them to really to really get in touch with networks, with elders within the community, knowledge keepers, apart from the standard process of mentorship, which may be more westernized. So I think it's always good. And I really believe as well that we all have different looks, different experiences, different languages, and we all need to take the day like today, Indigenous Peoples Day, to find those reflections on who we are. And I can say that I am very proud when I hear colleagues who are newly learning about their culture, and I want to equip them and give them that opportunity to also learn from my culture and also learn what they want. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Patrick, I'm just going to ask you the same question. If you want me to repeat it, don't hesitate to let me know.
No, that's good. And I mean, Toonie Julie really, hit the nail on the head there. So maybe, the only thing I'll add is always be yourself, right? And never, ever give up or bend on your values and your principles. And that'll vary, right? Based on cultures, based on who you are as an individual. So never lose sight of who you are as an individual, and never be, you never be ashamed, or you never have to ask for forgiveness to be yourself, right? Never lose sight of that. I would also say, and we've heard it, I think, throughout this whole session, is build your, I call it safe space. Build your own personal, like what you need to be supported as a public servant in the public service. And again, that'll vary based on what you need. Do you need mentors? Do you need sponsorship? Do you need just someone you could trust to check in with every once in a while and share your frustrations or share your successes, right? So, as they say in French, encadre-toi avec quoi tu as besoin pour avoir du succès. So, and again, that's not just going to fall from the sky. You got to go get it, right? So it's on you as an individual to really make sure that you have the supports that you need to support you throughout your career and to meet the ambitions that you set for yourself. And don't forget, leadership takes various shapes and forms, right? And it's at all levels. Like, you don't have to be an ADM to be a leader, right? You could be as powerful a leader, if not more, as a CR4 or as an AS1, right? So never forget that everybody, no matter what you are or who you are in the organization, you have a sphere of influence and control around you. And never forget about that. And always go in every day trying to do the best that you could do within that sphere of control. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We went through quite a few questions. I think we had 13 suggested questions. We went through 10 of them. I think we have 3 that remain outstanding, but I would just recommend to the Knowledge Center, potentially, if possible, you have a great list here of very interested employees from across the public service. Over 230 folks, I believe, registered. So some of the information requested is more about the career pathway document, Anna, the mentorship and how to access a mentor, and any advice that people would have about mentoring. So I think if it's possible to even submit that information through a communique to the folks that registered, I think that would be very helpful to a number of people that shared that interest today. Je veux remercier vraiment tous nos présentateurs qui ont partagé leurs expériences personnelles et professionnelles avec vous. Je pense qu'ils ont donné des conseils plus qu'appropriés, vraiment fantastiques. Et c'est de l'information qui est vraiment essentielle pour plusieurs d'entre vous, je suis certaine, pour pouvoir vous aider vraiment à naviguer les prochaines étapes de votre carrière. I want to thank all of our panelists and speakers today for really invaluable information, excellent advice, both personally and professionally, that you've shared. Very brave of you to do so. And I think it's incredibly helpful, I'm sure, for a number of people that registered to today's events as they progress through the years of their career. I wish I had this type of advice myself when I was an Indigenous student, and then when I left the public service, and then when I rejoined through an interchange. And I think in those days, I would say these types of conversations did not happen as frequently or as in such an accessible way. Alors, c'est un privilège et on vous remercie. I will now invite Elder Smith, notre aîné aujourd'hui, Michelle Smith, de faire la clôture de notre événement. I'll invite Elder Michelle Smith to close our meeting today.
Oleone. Creator, we give you thanks for bringing us together on this beautiful day. On remercie les organisateurs de la session, le réseau des jeunes fonctionnaires ainsi que le Cercle du savoir pour l'inclusion autochtone au sein de la fonction publique. We give thanks to Marcella and Josh and Alexis. We thank our speakers for their gifts of knowledge and wisdom. We thank Deputy Minister Fox, Associate DM Gideon, and my friends Anna, Patrick, and Julie, for sharing that knowledge with us today. Creator, give us the strength and the wisdom to pursue our career paths in a good and enlightened way. Oleone, Chimigwech, Niawan, Kuyanamik, mercy, thank you Merci. Hauts.
Wilaliuk. Take care, everyone.